guys, you got to call me Steve. Only my mom calls me Dr. Schlossman. So it's funny. Just the opportunity to see Evil Dead 2, not me holding the brains. We'll get through that crap quick, then we'll get to the movie. I was listening to folks talk in the audience, and somebody said, "Is this your first time or not?" And they actually referred to somebody as an Evil Dead virgin, which sounds like a bad porn movie when you think about it. So I'm not going to talk about that because we're staying wholesome, as we talked about. What we're going to do, here's the agenda. I love horror films. I've always loved them since I was little. I've wanted to be a doctor since I was 26, and my dad made me. I've wanted to be a horror writer since I was 8, literally. And actually, that's fairly consistent with the literature. If you look at the literature, the folks who like horror films and have learned to like them and have all this nostalgic reverie attached to them, it starts really early. And there's this wonderful kind of camaraderie that gets created, which is why they have to be shown on a big screen. They really, you can watch them on your computer, and that's where I watch a lot of them, but the opportunity to come together like this is actually what makes it really fun, and this movie is really, really fun. It's really one of my favorites. So we're going to do this talk. That's me holding brains. That's a jar of sheep brains. For the record, no sheep. Well, sheep were killed for those brains, but they were killed not just for those brains. They were you can buy those from the biological supply companies, and I take them around elementary schools. I'm invited. I don't just show up, and they have me dissect them, and it's actually really fun. The kids, I did a horror writing workshop at an elementary school in Arlington last year. That was so much fun. You give 9-year-olds permission to write something scary. And we gave them a stimulus sentence, which was, this morning, my hamster Sparky seemed funny. That was the opening sentence. And they came up with the scary stuff. Then after that, we hacked those very brains to pieces, and they had a good time. So that's why we have that picture there. So I reached out to a lot of my folks. I've gotten a little bit involved in this industry, as was mentioned. I'm pretty good friends with George Romero, which actually started because of this program. I called him literally the week before I gave that Night of the Living Dead talk. George called me back. Since then, we've become friends. We get together about once a month. So I've sort of, through him, gotten to know a lot of other horror writers, enthusiast speakers. Even heard from Bruce Campbell about this presentation. I was speaking with Larry Fessenden yesterday. If you guys don't recognize him, he's the founder of Glass Eye Pix. It's one of my favorite independent movie studios. They did movies like Stakeland, Habit, I Sell the Dead, really great films. And I asked him, what do you like about horror? And this was what he came up with. Horror is both existential and confrontational, upsetting the viewer out of complacency, which is fairly highbrow, but it's really getting to what we're going for here. And we're going to talk about this from the perspective of how the brain handles it. What do we do when we're confronted with images, which you're going to see in Evil Dead 2, by the way? What do we do when we're confronted with these images that don't quite add up, but add up just enough to be off-putting? We're startled out of complacency, and it allows us actually to draw some kind of social conclusions that we actually didn't plan on drawing. Certainly Dawn of the Dead's a great example of that. So that's the highbrow part. Let's bring it down a little bit. This is the real title of the talk. This is what I want you all to go home with. You've got to somehow explain to your fill in the blank, your wife, husband, kids, mother, in my case, that you like this stuff. And so to put this in perspective, there's my mom. So nice Jewish mother from Kansas, like I am. I'm not a mother, I'm a nice Jewish boy from Kansas. That's my father, retired pulmonologist. That's my niece, Sarah. This was some family vacation. My family, I'll show you in a second. Couldn't look any nicer. I got to tell her that I like this. This is what I have to tell her. That's one of my all-time favorite movies. And to my mom's credit, I was showing her these slides over February vacation, and she said, "Oh, dear, that's from Alien. I love that movie." So it was very sweet of her to say that. How do we explain ourselves? How do I explain this to the dean of my medical? It may surprise some of you to know that Harvard's a bit of a stodgy place. And the medical school is not always enamored of my giving these talks. So that's kind of what we're going to go for today, is make a little bit of science out of this affinity that we all bring to the table. Those are my kids. I also have to explain it to them, and I show them for two reasons. One is I just like showing my kids. The other is the younger one. Oops, sorry, we just jumped forward to George. Hold on. The younger one with you can't quite see her because of the silhouette. She's curly hair. She's loves to giggle, would run around naked with a bucket on her head. She's just a wonderfully crazy kid. She loves scary movies. She and I watch The X-Files every night before we go to bed. It helps her to sleep. She really likes it. And I'm not going to show her The Exorcist, yet, but I'm going to, at some point, we'll watch that. My older daughter, she hates this stuff. So there is this real kind of binary thing where you don't find a lot of folks who are ambivalent about horror films, and there is some neurobiologic explanations for that. You find people who either really like it or really don't like it. Naomi, my younger daughter, loves it. It ain't about Fox Mulder for her. She's too young. It's for her, it's the scary stuff she likes. Whereas my older daughter, she can do without it. So how do we tell our family, how do we tell our kids this? Well, the first thing you do is you find some like-minded and lovable friends. And this is a long preface, but I think it's really important. We are pack animals. We actually need each other to enjoy what it is that we like. That's why you guys are here in this theater today. So that's from the Denver Film Festival. George Romero in the middle, Max Brooks looking at George. I'm there on the other side. We did this zombie town hall meeting where they had us up on stage and talked about why zombies are popular. Paramount made a documentary of it, and it's actually one of the extras on World War Z. Only on the Blu-ray, only in the Walmart version. I don't know how Hollywood works. So, but the point of this is that I like these guys because they made stuff that I'm really, really, really fond of. I love the work that both of them have done, but I like them more because I can sit around and talk about horror films with them forever. And as George said, when he invited my wife and me to come see the premiere of Survival of the Dead, which I liked, although it didn't do that well, my wife had never seen a horror film ever in the theater. And I said, George, I don't know if she's going to come. And he said, she doesn't like horror, she can stay home and play with the cat. We're going to a horror film. So that's what George and Max and I can get around and talk about. That's what we talked about for an hour in this thing. So you find people that you like, and then you figure out what you're going to talk about. So here's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to make the case that we like horror films or horror stories. We have to first begin with the idea that we like stories, and that seems kind of obvious. But there is a neurobiologic area of investigation into why our brains crave things presented to us in a narrative format. If you think back to all of the teachers that you liked, they didn't do what I'm doing. They didn't do bullet points of PowerPoints. They told you stories. And stories actually have a way of sort of making you look at the world differently. And I can show you that your brain actually experiences the world differently as a result of that. We'll go from that to sort of say, well, if we like stories, some of us like horror films, which are becoming incredibly popular, as you guys know. Even movies like Ouija, which wasn't that good, stuck around in the theaters for a long time. And it's actually great fun to watch. So these movies have become more and more and more popular. We're going to tie it to nostalgia and the neurobiology that goes with nostalgia. And then we're going to kind of make the case. You can go home to your mom, sister, whatever, who you have to fill in the blank with, and say you're not a horrible person for liking this stuff. Those of you who dragged like a date here, you'll be able to say, I'm not horrible because I like this movie. Or you could just say, this is my boomstick or something like that, like Bruce Campbell said later. And then we'll make our way into the concept of the uncanny. So, boring slide. Bottom line of this slide is when you, in this case, read a story, and this is using functional MRI, so you put somebody in the MRI scanner and you watch what their brain does in real time as they're doing something, which is actually relatively new technology. I know it seems kind of old because we hear this all the time. We couldn't have done this even when I was in medical school, and I didn't go to med school that long ago. So basically what's found here is that you marshaled not only visual input, but also motor input, and that means that stories are a kind of hypnosis. They make us, in our mind's eye, act out the characters that we're seeing or hearing about. And they do that by marshaling all regions of the brain, and you can see that in this next slide. The only thing to take home from this slide is how many different pathways of the brain are being recruited here. So it's not, nothing else does this other than stories. Nothing else marshals the occipital lobe so you can see the story if it's something you're seeing on the screen, or the olfactory area, or an olfactory auditory area if you're hearing it, as well as adding valence to it in the amygdala, and we'll get to all these points, as well as making you think about what it is that you like about the story. Only stories do this, and our brains crave this activity. In fact, I'm going to show you this next slide, which shows that when we read, this was a study done using novels, when we read novels, we actually experience novelty, and novelty feels good. So all those regions of the brain that are outlined on this slide, I'm sorry it's a little bit blurry, but the nucleus accumbens, the ventral tegmental area, the substantia nigra, all of those secrete dopamine. All of those give you a dopaminergic reward tweak. Feels good. Actually, it's the same tweak that you get when you gamble if you like gambling. If you think about it, gambling's a bit of a story. It has an arc to it. Hopefully it's an arc that ends the way you like it to, but it's an arc. So our brains enjoy stories, and when they hear stories, they experience things in a different way than they would have otherwise, precisely by marshaling all of those different brain regions, and that feels good. That dopamine gets squirted out, and you want more. That's why you guys are all here to see Evil Dead for the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th time, how many times you've seen it. So stories, just to review that part really quickly, they make the inaccessible more accessible. Things that you didn't think you could grasp, you can more easily grasp because of a story. They accomplish this by marshaling multiple brain regions, so you get all sorts of different pathways involved that allow you to look at things from a different angle. We think about things differently as a result of that. That feels good to us. That's a reward. And you can imagine a teleologic explanation for that. Teleologic, as you guys know, just means after the fact. So there is a reason that we kind of crave the novelty that stories bring to the table. They allow us to make sense of things in displacement that we might not otherwise be able to tolerate. This is actually a prime purpose of horror films. They force us, as Larry said yesterday on the phone to me, out of complacency. So they make us sort of look at the world in a different way. And there's always something that doesn't quite add up. So here's an ancient cave drawing, right? But it's not an ancient cave drawing. So everybody chuckles there, and what's happening when you laugh, by the way, is your lower brain and your higher brain are actually talking to each other. Lower brain sees what's funny and then asks itself, what do I find funny there? And the higher brain kicks it in and says, well, I'll tell you what's funny. There were no shopping carts back then. So nothing makes a joke unfunny like telling you what's funny about a joke. So I just screwed that up. But the point here is that stories are old, and then our appreciation for stories comes from our appreciation for the novelty of a story being retold in a new way. And nothing does that, again, like horror films. Horror films are intensely derivative. Every horror film is related to every other horror film, really every other horror film. One of the reasons I love this movie that y'all are going to see is it has within it basically a love song to great horror films that came before it and a million that come after it. You can see bits of Cabin in the Woods, of Hellraiser. It would just go on and on and on. So, again, we now know that stories matter, but we're not talking, Westerns. We're not talking musicals. We're talking my mommy, okay? We're talking about my mommy and my daddy, and I have to tell them I like this. So how do we do that? So what we're going to do is tie horror to this notion of nostalgic recollections, how we remember things, and many of you, I'm going to ask you a question in a second about, so I want you to start thinking the first scary movie that you saw. I taught a freshman seminar this year at Harvard on horror films, and actually Harvard students write scary stories. They wrote some really, really scary, all of them involved final exams, which I thought was kind of funny, but they honestly did. It was like, it's time to take the final, and he turned into a bat and flew away or something. So they all wrote these very, very, very scary stories, but their recollections of the first scary story was actually a really fun exercise because it jibed really well with the research. That'll lead us into these neurocognitive areas of investigation, including pattern recognition and confirmation bias. From there, we'll talk about meta-emotional, metacognitive experiences. That actually goes with the love of horror. If you look at the studies of horror, it's not people who aren't afraid. People actually are very afraid in horror films. They like being afraid. That's a key difference here. A lot of folks say, it's like, you go in to sort of conquer the film and walk out. It didn't bug me. Those people actually, when you look at the research, and Hollywood's done a lot of this research, and the market research, they tend not to like the movies. If you measure people's heart rates, and I'll show you these slides in a second, and their blood pressure, the ones who don't have it increased, don't have a sense of autonomic arousal, of a fear response, they tend not to go back to the movie. It's the ones who find themselves frightened and giddy with that fear that they come back over and over again. All of this leads to this kind of friendship because it's fun to be in this room together, and friends will be made tonight in watching this movie. Folks who didn't know each other will get to know each other, and then there's a kind of redemption that comes from that. So, story time, because I told you stories matter. When I was 11 years old, I saw the first movie that really scared the crap out of me. I mean, it just really got to me. So before I tell you what movie that was, somebody shout out, I just like doing this. Who's first scary movie somebody remembers seeing? Halloween. Wait, what was the evil one? Oh, yeah, great one. One more. Poltergeist. It. Oh, I have it on the slide later. That is one scary clown. My God. Wait, Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So this is so wonderful. You know what's interesting? There's like a generation issue. So all of you are sort of nailing the slasher films when you think about it. So the slasher films, which came out in the sort of late 80s, or early 80s to late 80s. I just rewatched Nightmare on Elm Street again. Boy, is that a good film. I'd forgotten how good that is. For me, the first movie that ever scared me, I'm 48 now, so I was 11 years old. I remember this like it was yesterday in the wood-paneled, 70s basement. My parents were out for the night. My sister was doing a sleepover. I had this mongrel of a dog that sat next to me. I had a thing of Doritos and a thing of Dr. Pepper, and I turned on the TV, and on network television, it was the scariest movie I'd ever seen. You know what that's from? Salem's Lot. That movie is it was a miniseries actually. It is so scary. So in this scene, this is a scene, I'll just remind you to sort of set it up. This is when the two brothers do that thing that you do in horror films. We could go the long way home, but let's go through the woods instead, which they always do, right? So they go through the woods, and the younger brother just disappears. You see this black sort of thing envelop him and cover him up, and he's gone. The older brother gets home, realizes he's screwed up. He doesn't think anything bad's happened to his brother. He just knows he shouldn't have taken the shortcut, and his brother got lost. He sort of sheepishly admits this to his parents. His parents send him to bed. They're mad at him. They call the police. They say, can you help us find our son? And then the older brother looks out his second-story window and sees his little brother floating outside the window, scratching on the glass like that. I was 11 when that scene happened. When he scratches on the glass with that creepy smile, it was game over. It was like every light in the house I turned on. My dog, I was terrified. I'm Jewish, and I was making crosses out of little pieces of things like that because this is what these movies do. It was great fun. I had a great time. At the same time, when I was 11 years old, I saw this movie. What's that? Dawn of the Dead. So I snuck out of the house. I told my parents I was going to see The Jerk, and I saw Dawn of the Dead instead. Snuck in because it was R-rated. It was a hard R, too. And then actually was too frightened to walk home. I lived near the theaters in Kansas City, so I had to call my folks and say, hey, can you give me a lift home? And they said, why? I thought you saw Steve Martin in The Jerk. I was like, oh, I saw Dawn of the Dead. I lied. So I had to be brought home. They picked me up, took me home. The wonderful circularity of this is the man who made that movie is now one of my pals who's adapting the book I wrote for a film. So it's this kind of wonderful, kind of full circle nature of things. Both of those happened when I was 11 years old, and it turns out that is the average age of onset for when people first start watching horror films. I started watching these movies on the creature features from 10 to noon on the UHF stations on Saturday morning. That's the average age of onset for most people when they remember watching a scary movie in a video format. Because of that, my nice grandma Bobby bought me this book, which I actually found the cover of online. It did not exist as a PDF magazine back then, but it does now apparently. She bought me that book, and I got so interested in those early Universal films, later the Hammer films, and then sort of kept following this trend up. And that's consistent with what's happened nowadays, where the popularity of horror films seems to be going up. So before we get to the hard science, a little bit of social science here, you can see the blue line there are horror films overall. The blue line is right. The red line is all films combined, and you can see that there's a increase somewhere around the mid-1990s where the number of horror films skyrockets, in part because of DVDs, so people can watch them at home, and in part because they found that horror films will linger around in the theaters longer than will other films. So they can get them to sort of stick around in the theater, and people will still go and see them over and over and over again, actually. People will see, I saw The Conjuring 2 or 3 times in the theater. We'll give a slide for that in a second. So you're not alone if you start watching these, and this is a study from Media Psychology. The average age of onset was 11, and here's the fascinating part. If you anticipated being afraid of what you were going to see, it predicted later viewing. So people who said, I'm going to be afraid, I'm not sure I want to watch this, they were much more likely to watch the movie than the people who either said, I don't care, I'm not into it, or I can't possibly watch this. Those people actually tended not to. This isn't a value judgment. This is just a way of sort of people are unique and different, and there is a subgenre of folks who like these kinds of movies. And if I've learned anything on the horror convention circuit that I've been on, there's no way to sort of pin down who's likely to like a horror film. It's all comers, all types, and you can sit down, and once you start talking about it, it's like talking about sports or Bob Dylan. You talk forever about their work. So those who like horror like being afraid in the movie. if you don't like being afraid in the movie, most of us don't like being afraid for real. We don't like it if we're actually being chased by Jason. That's a bad moment in your life. But if you're watching somebody chase Jason in the movie, there's just enough displacement that you can imagine being up there, and we enjoy, weirdly, that experience. If you don't enjoy that experience, you tend not to go back. My wife has seen exactly one horror film on the big screen. That was Survival of the Dead. She said, I'm done. I said, that wasn't even a very good one. And she said, I'm done. I'm not seeing any more. We're done. So what do I get my kids to sleep, I get my wife to sleep, and I go out to the 10 o'clock shows of horror films because I will not see them on the computer unless I have to. I'd much rather see them the way all of you have shown up. So neurobiologically, what's going on? So this is your brain on horror. I think this is from Day of the Dead. This is classic George, where the zombie stumbles into the toilet stall, finds an old book, which I think is the Bible, by the way, and then decides he's going to sit down and try and make some sense of it. To understand how your brain processes horror, we have to understand this concept of meta-emotions and metacognitions. That's fancy language for just basically it's a step further than what you feel or what you think. It's how you know what you feel, how you know what you think. What do I think about what I think? That's where all the studies have gone on this. So it's taking things from the more primitive to the more sophisticated regions of the brain. You feel something in the amygdala. That's oversimplified, but we'll say that for right now. The amygdala is Greek for almond-shaped. It's that, you can see it right there. It's that sort of almond-shaped region. Way down low, everything that's got a brain that's a little bit like us has an amygdala. Crocodiles, lizards, shrews, on up. We feel it there. We think about what we feel up in the prefrontal cortex, in that region of the brain that's right here. That's where we actually start to think about why it is that we're having the experience that we're having. And in fact, being human involves a seamless communication between those two, between the lower brain and the higher brain. That's actually what makes you sit down and enjoy these movies. It also makes you enjoy Justin Bieber if you happen to, but it's what accounts for personal taste. The more frightened you are, the more fun you have. So this was a really fascinating study that's actually consists of a bunch of other ones. I just chose this one from communications research. What they found is that if you send people to scary movies and you say, how did you feel about that movie? And if they say, I did not like it, in fact, I was really frightened, and then you say, did you have fun? They're much more likely to say yes. If the people say, I was terrified before they say I did not like it, then they're probably not going to have fun. If they say, I didn't care about it, didn't get me one way or the other, they're also not likely to like it. So how did they do this study? They took a random sample of moviegoers. They controlled for first-time moviegoers. You wouldn't want people who've just seen movies for the first time, because then it might be the experience of the movie that would sort of lead to this overwhelming emotional experience. And then they had this Likert scale, something called the need for affect scale. Likert is just one of those, scores where it's like, always, sometimes, never. There's usually 4 or 5 things that you check off. And they ask them, how do you feel about yourself in terms of your tendency to like affect, to like emotion? And all of these are normal, but it ranged from this need to feel strong emotions, which it turns out that folks who like horror films actually enjoy, to emotions are dangerous. It's not an abnormal state. It just might be that I don't like feeling things strongly, and I just don't want to go there. The people who tend to like scary movies, and again, these are generalizations, tend to sort of hover on the liking scary movies because they like to feel things strongly. And then what they did was really fascinating. They said, well, do they feel things strongly as a function of being scared? Let's measure that. Let's measure adrenergic arousal, the fight or flight response. So let's measure skin conductance, because if you sweat, you get more sodium ions, and that conducts electricity better. Let's measure heart rate. Let's measure blood pressure. If we measure all of those things, we can find out the people who are really wound up when they see scary movies versus the people who are, they could take it or leave it. Here's what they found. People who felt this way when they first saw the movie left the movie feeling this way. So people whose skin conductance and heart rate and blood pressure suggest that, as many of you will experience, when this movie gets rolling, it's like on speed. So when it's rolling, you're gonna kind of feel your heart rate go up. It's not a terrifying movie, but it's enough of a rush that you'll feel that, and then you'll walk out, those of you who like it, with a great big smile on your face, and then you'll go home with whoever you came here with, or just talk to the person next to you and you'll ask each other, why did I like that so much? That's a metacognition. That's a meta-emotion. That's a meta-emotional process. Why did I feel what I felt? Why do we like this? Why would that be possible? It's because our brains like puzzles. Our brains are really big, and they like to be engaged in a way that involves both the lower brain, I'm frightened, and the higher brain, what makes me frightened. We like asking ourselves, why are we frightened? So we're going to do a little exercise here. Common cinema image here. I'm going to change these three people with my crappy photoshopping skills, so I apologize for that right now. I want you to tell me, because this is a nice segue into pattern recognition, which one you think would be the most unsettling to see. Forget the fact that it would be unsettling to see any of them right now, but which one would be the most unsettling to see? Dorothy. Okay, I think Dorothy's the most unsettling. So there's a reason for that. Now, the scarecrow wants a brain, but if you just put a brain there, it's not funny. It's not a moment of sort of two things that sort of approach but aren't quite the same. Pattern recognition is when you take something recognizable and you tweak it just enough so that it's still recognizable but different in a way that makes you pay attention, that creates novelty, creates that reward. It doesn't make any sense for the Tin Man to be a zombie. Right? The Tin Man and zombies don't go together. You could have a zombie Tin Man, I guess, but it's not the same storyline. It does make sense to you that Dorothy could be possessed by a demon, that Dorothy could become the girl from The Exorcist. So let's do a similar experiment. We find dogs cute. I find dogs. I have two dogs. I love them both. I have one 120-pound dog and one 7-pound dog, believe it or not. You can ask a 2-year-old how... Well, I'll back up. Can you tell me, let's say you're an alien visiting from another planet, and you needed to know definitively how to separate a dog from a cat. What would you say? What would you tell that person? You're writing the criteria for dog versus cat. Oh, you could say personality, but I got to tell you, my 7-pound dog is a cat. He's a sociopath too, but he's a cat. You could do sounds, although I'm obviously going to thwart everything that people say right now. But the reason I'm doing that is if the guy who came up with this exercise, Jeff Norman, who's a professor actually of physics at McMaster, his point was there are enough dogs that sound enough like cats, enough cats that sound enough like dogs, that you wouldn't, if you had never seen either one, definitively be able to separate the two. The only real way, the veterinary students sometimes get it, it's retractable claws and the shapes of their eyes, basically. Those are the two that definitely separate the two. Otherwise, you got forelegs, you got fur, you got pets, you got domestication, but that's all a dumb answer. The real answer, how do you know that's a dog? It looks like a dog. Right, it looks like a dog. 2-year-old can tell you that. That's pattern recognition. That's the source of how we make sense of the world. It's actually the source of prejudice and bias, too, because we start to recognize and decide that we know what we think we already know at a very early age. So what horror films do, they play with that. So you take a cute pug, right, and we change him just a little bit, right? So now you've got cat eyes on your pug. Cats are really cute. And dogs are really cute, but this doesn't add up with your pattern recognition, right? So first of all, your amygdala screams. Your amygdala says, that ain't right. And then it talks to your frontal lobe, and the frontal lobe says, well, what's not right? What am I looking at? I'm looking at a cat with dog face or a dog with cat eyes. When I was in high school, I did not really, I'm trying to escape culpability here. My friends purchased from the lab assistant at the public school that I went to a bunch of fetal pigs. This was not okay. This was uncool. Although it was kind of funny at the time, but it was uncool. And they dressed them in Barbie clothes, and they put them in the high chair at McDonald's, which was where I grew up. It was actually literally life-threatening because we went in and people would just kind of stare at it, and before they were frightened of it, they were trying to make sense of what it was. Is it an alien? Is it what am I looking at exactly? The second time we went into the McDonald's, the guy had a shotgun behind the counter because that's where I grew up. So we only did that prank once. The point is that it was pattern recognition at work there, right? It was is that a pig? Is that a human? What am I looking at? Now, you can take this too far, as we did with the scarecrow wanting a brain. This also could be my crappy photoshopping techniques, but if we add goat eyes to our pug, it just becomes funny, right? There's something about a dog and a cat being closely enough related that when you combine the two like that, it's pretty unsettling. That would be a scary dog to see. So pattern recognition allows us to tell a news story. I don't need to read for you the definition of pattern recognition. We've sort of described it there. But the absence of a clear match with something for which you already have a template, that allows a news story to be told. That's in spades in this movie, in Evil Dead 2. Sometimes metaprocesses happen at a narrative level. They don't just happen in terms of images. What movie is that? The Conjuring is such a good movie. It really was one of my very favorite scary movies ever. Another one where nice Jewish boy is terrified of the devil suddenly. He's not there in the Old Testament. In this scene, this is one of those moments where everybody in the theater laughed. Because what do? They find, the sort of classic hidden staircase that's in the house that was priced less than it ought to have been priced because there's something about the house they don't know, blah, blah, blah. It goes on and on. So they bang on the sort of hollow area. They open it up. They find the staircase. And what does he do? This is earlier in the movie. He says, honey, bring me the matches. Not a flashlight? He says, bring me the matches. Now, the filmmaker, I think this was a meta-narrative moment because it doesn't make any sense that this guy was a truck driver. I guarantee he had a flashlight in the movie. But the filmmaker just couldn't resist the glee of having a match down there. The idea that there might be something very scary and then the match would go out. Or the match might burn your fingers and you'd shake it off. All of those things build tension. So you're then thinking to yourself, why would Mr. Wan, the guy who made this movie, why would he have done this? Why would he have them go down there with a match? Because it makes the movie more fun, even if it's less believable. And you'll see that in spades as well in Evil Dead 2. Sometimes metaprocesses are more visual. So this is obviously the priest from The Exorcist. This is before he absorbs the demon, and this is afterwards. Now, he's clearly recognizable as the same character, but within it you can see the changes that become derivative in horror films. Derivative means you see it over and over. It's derived from previous horror films. The sunken eyes, they usually build up the cheekbones a little bit. You'll see that on zombie sets. The pinpoint pupils, the change of the eye colors, things that actually really are associated with death or morbidity. In order to appreciate humor, we have to allow ourselves basically to get scared, to ask ourselves what scares us, and then to want to see it again. So that's Pan's Labyrinth. I will never understand how the same man who made this movie made Pacific Rim. It still doesn't make sense to me. I like Pacific Rim, but this movie is brilliant, and that is one of the most terrifying creatures I've ever seen in any movie. I bring that up because this particular image, because it turns out that the things that horror films like to play with the most, again, you'll see this in Evil Dead 2, are the regions of the body that have the most affective valence, the most emotional valence. If you look at studies of medical students during their cadaver dissections, the things they have the most trouble with, understandably, are dissecting the face, the eyes, and the hands. And these are the things that we associate most with our human. At least that's the explanation for a lot of the studies. So here you've actually got the hands and the eyes in one image. Pattern recognition mismatch is most potent for these affectively laden images. Sometimes there's a scholar named Lowenstein who calls this spectacle horror. So here, this is not a horror film at all, right? This is that famous picture from National Geographic back during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Those eyes are so haunting. They could be from a horror film. There's a scene from the movie you're about to see. There's a hand. So eyes and hands actually carry so much affective valence. And sometimes the eyes themselves are places to look in horror films. If you really want to make something scary, I've been on the set of people making horror films. It's really fun to watch how they pay special attention to the eyes. If you got rid of the eyes altogether, and replace them with something, it might not quite be as scary, although sometimes the eyeless character you can see as being scary, but they pay a lot of attention to these regions that they know we key into. Our brains are very wired to key into. They're very wired to look at eyes. They're very wired to look at hands. There's two sets of eyes. The vampire is the one from Salem's Lot. That's the final one, who looks an awful like Nosferatu, which I think is kind of cool. One of the neat things about that vampire is, look at his fangs. Those aren't my mom, I was showing her these slides again, and she said, honey, those aren't the canine teeth. She was all bothered that wasn't a proper vampire. Why do you think they did his teeth? I don't know why, but what comes to mind? What does he look like with those teeth up front? Looks like a snake. Yeah, he's like a serpent to me, and he makes a hissing noise in the way he strikes. So they're getting at you in this kind of unconscious way, kind of under the surface. That's Big Daddy from Day of the Dead, right before he leads the rebellion. You can see again the sort of sunken eyes, the cheekbone flesh that they build up there. And that leads to this kind of car wreck phenomena. Are we repulsed or are we interested in what we're seeing? We want to see it again. One of the ways horror films toys with you is basically it shows you an image, but very brief. Cloverfield did this. Shows you this image, but you never get to see it long enough. Aliens does this too, for that matter. So that's from Splice, right? And I love this image mostly because it drove me crazy that I couldn't just stare at the unmoving image of what they had created. And here you get to look at it. It is such an unsettling image there. But then you have to ask yourself, why? What is unsettling about it? Well, she's got like the legs of a chicken, and she's got this scorpion tail. Her face is completely symmetrical, and yet at the same time, you recognize the look on her face. She's basically mad at her mother, her creator, for not letting her out. It's a modern-day Frankenstein story. So this notion of the car wreck, why we always slow down when we pass a wrecked car, it's because in our mind's eye, we can see what it once was. That was once a well-put-together Volvo, and now it's not. We see that all the time. This leads to those existentialists. So Fessenden was quoting the existentialists in the beginning. One of my favorite passages from Nausea, Across the Street. I'm just going to read it because it's so chilling. Also, Jean-Paul himself had a problem with his eye, as you can note there. Across the street, he'll see something like a red rag blown towards him by the wind, and when the rag has gotten close to him, he'll see that it is a sight of rotten meat, grimy with dust, dragging itself along by crawling, skipping, a piece of writhing flesh, rolling in the gutter, spasmodically shooting out spurts of blood. That is dark. That's dark. That won the Nobel Prize, too. That's some dark shit that won the Nobel Prize. Sorry to swear. But I love that. I love that. So this is stuff that actually gets under our skin. That's the kind of definition of the uncanny, a term that Freud came up with back in 1919. He did not come up with it based on the band The Eels. The sort of they wrote that song "Beautiful Monster," which was in what movie? Shrek. Thank you. You guys are so good. I love so what's so interesting about her, again, it's the eyes. You see those great big huge eyes there. The uncanny valley is also something that's been talked about a lot, as you guys know, in robotics. It's why, actually, after Polar Express, they moved back to making animated films look like animated characters. The closer we got to things looking human, but not human, the more uncomfortable it became. So that the Tom Hanks character in Polar Express is actually really kind of uncomfortable to look at. The water looks perfect, but Hanks doesn't, whereas the characters in The Incredibles look great because we're used to cartoons. Finally, horror is intertextual. You're in on the joke. So you're going to see this movie. You're going to recognize other quotes from it. In writing about the remake of Fright Night, I love this quote. The contemporary horror film knows that you've seen it before. It knows that you know what it's about to happen, and it knows that you know it knows you know. So basically what they're pointing out is that you are in on the trope. You recognize what's supposed to happen. If there's a cabin out in the woods that a guy goes to visit with his girl to get away for the weekend, and you've shown up to see a horror film, something not good is going to happen. Those are the rules. In fact, there are whole movies based on these rules, right? There's Fright Night itself, where the only guy who can slay, this is the original Fright Night in 1985, who can beat the vampire is the guy who hosts the late night TV shows about vampires. He's not a real vampire killer, but the rules all seem to apply. In fact, he says everything I've tried so far works. And then Scream. Scream was the ultimate postmodern movie, right? Because they know the rules of the slasher film because they've all seen the slasher film. This is what drives me crazy about The Walking Dead. Why don't they ever say, you know what, these walkers seem an awful lot like those zombies Romero created? They never, it's like they lived in a world where no zombie movies had ever been made. It drives me nuts. Everything else is the same. I think the story would still work if they said, what's happened seems to be an awful lot like these movies that we've seen. But it's my take on it. So horror is about nostalgia. It's about stories, our brain's desire to make sense of stories, and it's about redemption. It's rare in the horror film that the good guys all lose. So that's the clown from It. That's Pennywise, really scary clown. Who beats him? It's a bunch of kids. A bunch of kids, and then when they grow up, a bunch of young adults come back and take them on. It's usually the sort of really good guys stick together. This is Stephen King will tell you, that his horror stories aren't about horror, they're about friendship. They're about people sort of bonding together and fighting off that thing that couldn't be fought off single-handedly or alone. That's why I like horror. This is a great movie, if you didn't get a chance to see Paranorman, because it's the kids or the friendship that actually pushes back and beats these things. So that's what I had for you. Sorry, I went on for a little bit long there. I have no idea what y'all want me to do now. We can watch the movie. We can ask questions, whatever works best for y'all. Thank you. What do you want? Should we just go to the movie?